Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have another great show planned for you all today. Nice to be back. Brianna, hello.
Hello. Let's get right into it today. It's a big show. FBI Director Christopher Wray has acknowledged that the Bureau believes that COVID-19 was likely the result of a lab accident in Wuhan, China. Let's hear what he had to say.
The FBI has for quite some time now assessed that the origins of the pandemic are most likely a potential lab incident in Wuhan. Let me step back for a second. The FBI has folks, agents, professionals, analysts, virologists, microbiologists, et cetera, who focus specifically on the dangers of biological threats, which include things like novel viruses like COVID, and the concerns that in the wrong hands, some bad guys, a hostile nation state, a terrorist, a criminal, the threats that those could pose. So here you're talking about a potential leak from a Chinese government-controlled lab that killed millions of Americans, and that's precisely what that capability was designed for.
Now, this comes just days after the Department of Energy's low confidence assessment that COVID-19 most likely originated from a lab leak in China.
Now, some of LabLeak's critics are arguing that getting to the bottom of the origins of COVID is a fool's errand. Researcher Michael Osterholm had this to say on CNN yesterday.
I think we have to move on. And I worry that we're wasting time getting prepared for the next virus to hit us, where both lab leaks and the potential for spillover are real possibilities. That's what we should be spending our time doing right now. I promise you that in 10 years from now, we will not be any closer to solving where did this virus come from.
Joining us now to discuss is molecular biologist and scientific advisor at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, Alina Chan. Alina, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, you recently tweeted that we have now entered the 4th year of not having a credible, rigorous investigation of the origin of COVID. Are we waiting for its 100th anniversary or the next pandemic before a bipartisan investigation can get underway? So what do you have to say to those in the commentariat who say, no, we should just move on, we won't know in 10 years?
I'd ask them to imagine doing that for any other major crisis. So just look at anything else, like plane crashes, don't investigate, let's just move on. I think that's amazing. So the reason why it's important to find the origin of COVID-19 is threefold. So the first thing is to inform pandemic prevention. Unless you can understand the series of events that led to this pandemic starting, it'll be difficult to implement precise countermeasures to address each one of those risks. And the second thing is deterrence. So this is an accidental lab leak if it came from a lab. But if you show the world that you have no way of investigating, this opens the door to bad actors, to people who could just say, I'll release this pathogen, and the even the US cannot investigate because the scientists there will run cover for us and say, oh, don't waste your time and energy, we'll never find the origins. And the last is really to find closure. So this isn't just about telling random people on the internet that you were right. This is about answering a question of how this pandemic started, a pandemic that's taken millions of lives, caused trillions in economic damage.
When you look at the second clip we played there and the State Department official saying, 10 years from now, we still won't know. How much of that do you think at this point is actually speaking reality into existence? The fact that we've waited so long to conduct substantial investigations, has it put us in a place where, in fact, it is unlikely that the evidence that would have led us to understanding how COVID actually originated is long gone? Or do you think there's still a chance that there are things to find out that will help to give clarity here?
I'm quite optimistic because if this pandemic did start in a lab, there might be communications and documents that are here in the US describing work that was done in that Wuhan lab. But you are right that having waited so long, a lot of the evidence might have been destroyed or just lost to time. So the people who try to suppress the lab leak theory, they really did a lot of damage in terms of being able to find the origin of COVID-19.
So this has been quite a week for anyone who wanted to remain open-minded about the possibility of COVID having come from the lab, with the Energy Department revising its assessment and leaning now in the direction of a lab leak. This has prompted a lot of mainstream media coverage of this, almost as if for the first time. Previously outlets and journalists and commentators who really maligned people who raised the possibility of lab leak, in fact, even implying that they were conspiracy theorists or somehow racist even. I kind of have egg on their face. So, we're having this conversation again, as if it's the first time. What are your impressions over the last few days of watching this now being discussed now that another government agency is leaning in that direction?
Well, I think I've seen the most aggression and shock from those who push the market origin very strongly. So these small group of influential scientists who tried to tell everyone that they had evidence of a sick animal in that market, now they kind of have to hedge their bets a bit and say, okay, maybe there might be evidence of a lab, and then what are they going to do to explain their past behavior? So I think that. I think that the magnanimous thing to do is to just step back and stop all the I told you so's and just say, let's find the origin of COVID-19. So I'm willing to put aside all of the abuse that was heaped on me by that side and just forgive all of the harassment and bullying from both sides and just focus on finding answers, focus on finding evidence. So there are things that should be done, and I think that we have to push as strongly as possible for a bipartisan investigation of the origins this year, because if not this year, then when?
I'm interested to ask you, as someone within the kind of scientific community, how you feel about the tensions between folks who it feels like maybe were even protective of the natural origin theory, in part because they see real value in doing the kind of research that might have led to the outbreak of COVID, and not wanting to perhaps prematurely stigmatize that kind of COVID pandemic prevention research. How do you negotiate those tensions as someone within the scientific community? And do you think that that kind of research is valuable, or the kind of thing that, frankly, especially after COVID, should be stopped, if not significantly curbed?
So to be specific, that type of research is one that has been highly endorsed by influential scientists, not just in China, but across the world, in the US, Europe, elsewhere. And that is to go out into the wild and find as many novel viruses that we've never seen before, bring them back to labs and understand stepwise how they might jump from animals to people, and then to develop vaccines or therapeutics against them. So you can't fault the scientists before the pandemic for thinking this way. They truly, I think, believed in this mission. But I think post-pandemic, you really have to be questioning what are the risks. So what are the consequences that might happen to the public if these pathogens are released into the environment, whether accidentally or intentionally. So I was very shocked last year to see that the EcoHealth Alliance, which was the middleman funding organization that had channeled US taxpayer dollars to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they were again granted another large amount of money to do more of the same work, but this time not in China, in Southeast Asia. So I think that it's extremely important for scientists, the scientific community, to look at this issue and think, are we doing what's in the best interest for people? And scientists are people, so it's not like your family members are not going to be hit by the next pandemic if it comes from a lab.
So my understanding is, at this point, if you're trying to weigh the two theories against each other, you have a lot of kind of circumstantial but very compelling notions about the lab leak theory, given all the safety concerns about that lab in particular, reporting from ProPublica and other places, the fact that we wouldn't necessarily if we're being honest, we wouldn't trust the Chinese government to tell us anyway. The proximity of the outbreak to this research facility that was doing exactly this kind of research and had the attitude you just described of going out in the wild, finding animals, collecting them, all of those concerns. On one hand, and then you have and also the fact that other lab leaks have occurred. Now, I didn't know that when the pandemic started, and we find out that that's actually a common occurrence at various labs. And then on the other side, you have the idea that this is in the past this has been an animal spillover event, it seems to me the scientific community, or many in it, have said that the genetic profile of the actual disease more closely resembles something that would come from the wild. Although I know there are people who debate that as well. But then we haven't actually found the crossover infected animal in the wild. So is that a fair assessment of why people are going one way or the other?
Yes, that's right. So we are dealing with a lot of incomplete, fragmented data. And this sort of explains why the IC agencies have reached all these conclusions, whether natural or lab, with such low confidence. So if you look at how the intelligence community defines their assessments, the confidence levels, is based on the evidence and the sources they're talking to. So low confidence means incomplete, fragmented evidence or sources that have questionable quality or credibility. So right now, we just have people on both sides, the lab or natural, screaming at each other saying our evidence, our circumstantial evidence is stronger than yours. But what we should be focused on is searching for that strong evidence that can help us move to a more confident assessment.
Some people have argued, this is a little bit more of a political question, that the reason that just now we're having agencies validate, even in a low confidence way, validate the possibility of lab leak theory being legitimate is because there is a political cohort that is potentially ginning up for a war with China, and that antagonism with China is good to sell that particular conflict. And I wonder if you've given any consideration to some of these political questions. Robby alluded to earlier the idea that early in the pandemic, the idea of validating lab leak theory was being framed as xenophobic in the media. And now there's this countervailing impulse to lean into the idea of lab leak theory is to validate a war effort that people might not agree with on its own. What do you say to people who make those kinds of claims and maybe make decisions about whether to believe or trust in the possibility of lab leak as a consequence of those claims?
So I think it would help a lot for the IC agencies to be more transparent with the routes of inquiry they have followed and what pieces of evidence they might have or how much of it at least is classified that they can't talk about and find ways to share it. So the moment you become more transparent, you explain to people how you reach those assessments, then you can deal with these speculations about whether these were made for political reason. I personally think that a war between China and the US would be world-ending. I highly doubt that people in government would be toying with that, like trying to start a war. I mean, we're so deeply integrated now that we, China can't survive without the US and the US can't survive without China, So I think it's a little bit maybe too dramatic to say that people are trying to start a war.
Well, I hope you're right.
We certainly hope that's the case. Alina Chan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.